There's a moment where a mom explains something to her daughters. She says, the whole point of promises is to build trust. And if there's no trust, none of this is possible. The kids push back. None of the whole world? She answers, none of it. No libraries, no roads, no power lines. The kids immediately argue about the power lines. And the mom holds her ground. Because without trust, even the invisible systems we rely on stop holding. It's a reminder for adults from Chili Gila, Bluey's mom, and Bluey. Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you a competitive advantage, an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world, looking for patterns and early warning signs, and asking how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's January 12th, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
I am great. You know this to be true, Eric. Every day I get is a great day.
True for all of us.
It is even greater because yesterday my Duke women's basketball team, it is wintertime, so you know I'm all over basketball. My Duke
Yep.
women's basketball team just finished a West Coast road trip to play Cal and Stanford. And they won both games, and now they're undefeated in the ACC,
Wow.
and the win at Stanford was the first time they've ever won in Maples Pavilion. Now you're saying, "Wait, Cal and Stanford are in the ACC?" Yes, they are. But man, they're coming along, and they look good, and they're getting contributions from different players, and I guess it just shows that early season where they had all those losses against really tough teams matters, but not in wins and losses. It matters in terms of how well you are prepared for the regular season, so that's pretty exciting. And then one other, Duke thing, one of my favorite players at Duke, is a guard named Aluchi Akanawa, and she transferred to Maryland, for this season from Duke, but she's crushing it, and I watched her play for Maryland. They unfortunately lost to Ohio State, but man, she's doing great too, so go Devils everywhere.
Mm, nice. So she got
Mhm.
paid and she's playing well. Nice.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to figure out how we make, the money in college sports a national security issue, but, if we run out of other topics, maybe we'll hit it because I just worry that we have no idea what we're doing, and it's gonna ruin one of the greatest things of all time, which are intercollegiate sports. But
Oh, for sure. Somehow the adults are still
yeah.
managing to ruin it.
Yep.
Even though the players are getting some recognition for their name, image, and likeness, the adults are still managing to bungle it up. And it's changed the landscape, right? Especially, I'm in all sports, but college football is really in focus right now. You saw a bunch of teams that rebuilt their rosters this year that are successful, bringing in transfers instead of homegrown talent.
Yeah, and then, if I go into my mom mode, I just think even for the individuals, this idea of if you're unhappy, go play for another team. If you're unhappy, go play for another team. Oof, I don't know that there are lots of stories when it works out well for the player. There are many, many more where, chasing playing time or money or something does not yield the long-term success that you hope. So I don't know. I think it's apropos for what we're going to talk about in this session. Just what happens when our institutions can't keep up with the way the world's turning.
Yeah. Another good example of an institution not keeping up.
Okay, so second episode of the new year, and we're going to continue to try and bring you events that reveal some larger trend or question or shared interest. So instead of just talking about the news, we're going to try and put it in some context. Last week, it was analyzing seemingly unrelated U.S. global actions, whether in Venezuela, Iran, or China, Taiwan, and Russia and Ukraine, and what they reveal about the national security strategy of the Trump administration. And a good song came with a new segment. So well done
And a
on.
romp around the world.
Anyway, by looking at things, instead of just talking about it, we really And to me, it helped me make an assessment that the U.S. strategy is about power, material gain, and scarcity rather than solely having a component of values of democracy, as has been the nation's want since the Cold War. And I'm not saying that every decision made by previous administrations was about values of democracy, but in this case, those seem to be taglines more than they seem to be the driver. And this week, we're going to tackle the nature of societal trust, and in particular, the thesis that free and open societies, particularly the US, require default trust, that is, a baseline assumption that our institutions and experts and alliances operate largely as advertised. And again, this isn't adjudicating every time whether you trust A or B. It's that you presume that when you go to the gas station and you push the button for the octane, that that's the octane that's coming in. We're going to look at some stories and try and see if some of the disquiet we feel is it caused solely by a single corrupt or norm-breaking leader, because those have always existed. Our worry is that our systems of accountability, verification, and connection are no longer able to absorb stress in a radically altered environment. And so if you'll give me one more second to just talk about this environment, because I talk about it a lot, but I just want to hit it here again. It really is a different time here, and we'll talk about actions and choices and leaders and institutions, but the world is different, right? We have
Mhm.
massive volumes of information, but little shared authority, instant global dissemination without any verification. Our algorithms are amplifying outrage and instantiating confirmation
Oh,
bias.
yeah.
We have weak or contested institutional arbiters of truth, and speed and access moves without constraint. And systems and institutions that were designed for deliberation and checks and balances and trust and expertise are struggling to function under these conditions. So the result isn't just merely confusion, but a collapse of shared reality and ultimately the trust that makes our society work. Let's talk about some things that are happening through this lens of trust as much as through the lens of what the event is itself. What do you think?
Let's do it. Let's
Yep.
get to some headlines. So, today we will discuss the release from the HHS of the new vaccine schedule based on primarily Denmark's approach. The Pentagon announced a new study on the effectiveness of, quote, women in combat. Over the weekend, the DOJ announced a criminal investigation into outgoing Fed Chair Jay Powell, ostensibly for making false statements to Congress. The president also truthed his intention to raise the defense budget to a staggering $1.5 trillion. Seems like we just talked about nearly $1 trillion. And the president and his Secretary of State announced that we're going to do something about Greenland, the easy way or the hard way.
I like that, Eric. The president truthed, not tweeted.
Yep,
Yeah,
it's a truth.
it's a truth.
That was really clever of them. All right, let's start with the vaccine schedule. So last week, the Department of Health and Human Services announced changes to the vaccine schedule for a couple different vaccines. RSV, rotavirus, hepatitis A, hepatitis B, meningococcal, and influenza. They haven't been removed from the schedule, but they're now being recommended differently. Instead of the broad default recommendations, some are now targeted to just high-risk groups. And it's all framed around, quote, shared clinical decision-making, where parents are told to consult with their doctor first. The New York Times had a really good episode on this January 8th, where they went into the summary on this. But we'll look at hepatitis B specifically. Hepatitis B is a highly contagious virus that attacks the liver and spreads through blood and bodily fluids. The vaccine was first developed in the early 1980s, and it was then only recommended for high-risk groups, primarily IV drug users, men who have sex with men. This approach didn't work. Cases kept climbing, and even tens of thousands of children were infected each year, many not through maternal transmission. So in 1991, federal health officials acted. They changed course and recommended the vaccine at birth. And within the last 2 decades, hepatitis B cases in children and young adults fell by roughly 99%. That success came from treating vaccination as a population-level public health decision, not an individualized risk calculation. We're going to really see some changes at the individual level where parents are confused, pediatricians are short on time, and the systems start to fray. The concern being, if you adjust the schedule, now less folks are going to get vaccines, not necessarily about hepatitis B, but measles and some of the other ones that are more prevalent and still part of the original vaccine schedule. All vaccines currently recommended by the CDC will remain covered by insurance without cost sharing, says Dr. Oz. No family will lose access. The framework empowers parents and physicians to make individualized decisions based on risk while maintaining strong protection against serious disease. Public health works only when people trust it, another doctor said. That trust depends on transparency, rigorous science, and respect for families. And then a final quote here: science demands continuous evaluation. Sue, that's a point that you've made routinely on the show. The whole point of science is a questioning science. So taking a look at Hep B specifically looks to me like it could be 20 years to flatten the curve. Now that we've got Hep B under manageable levels, maybe it is time to reevaluate this vaccine and see, do we need to keep giving it to children at birth or shortly after birth? Is that what's keeping the levels down? Or did we get it to a manageable level that now we can treat the disease when it presents instead of vaccinations against it?
I think this is a good story, and I think it has a lot of really interesting implications for trust. Number one is it's kind of late for this administration with the chaos of its other recommendations and its activities and Tylenol and autism to now say, yeah, but this one they're doing in a really sensible way, right?
Hmm.
So one, this whole thing of trust is, man, once you lose it, it is really hard to get back again. This is an example of fraying trust that now is putting all the burden at a really personal level, right? To say, hey, it's up to you. You can do it. You can not do it, whatever. Uh, But you still have a really big polarization in this country between people who trust expertise and people who don't, right? And so you're gonna have half the population who says, "Great, I don't have to anymore." And then you're gonna have another segment of the population that don't have the kind of preventive health and have relationships with their pediatricians and their doctors that allow them to have this conversation about what they should get right now. And so, man, to just all of a sudden after you've done a great deal to undermine confidence in science in general and governmental science especially, after you
Hmm.
have suggested that the motivation for most doctors is to make money via big pharma, now to say, but this time we're gonna look at it sensibly and do it. So, I I always think how you did things in the past should be examined against the context of the current and see whether you're doing the right thing. So yay, huzzah. And the way you describe why we made the Hep B choices we did a couple decades ago and whether we should still do that is a really good thing to do in general. There's a huge history of a solution that was designed against the conditions that existed a long time ago to see whether that still happens, and I think that's a good thing here. I just think you're making a sudden, unrealistic expectation on individuals. Do you remember when the nightly news used to break before commercial and their kinda tagline, their hook line would be, "It could kill you, and you might be eating it for dinner," and then they'd go to break? This feels like what they've done in this case. They said, "Well, you can still choose it if you want, but it might be really bad for you." And you're doing this before we've really sorted out the answer to your question. So don't mind the intent. I think it's the right direction, but I do think you need to be a little bit more thoughtful about just how broad the population is and what the real effect is going to be. Or is this another case where this administration is moving away from federal level regulation and leaving it all to individual choice, which is lovely, except not all individuals in America have access to the same information.
That's true. And one of the complaints was that pediatricians don't necessarily have the time to have that conversation with you. They're already strapped on their schedule and they're already seeing so many patients and whatnot, which is a totally different problem. But I just don't know that it's the job of the government to try to outthink the population and to say, well, if we change Hep B, then that's going to erode the trust in the rest of the vaccine schedule. And so we need to keep it on there, even though we don't really need it for babies, but we don't change the status quo.
Love it, then do the work. Then do the work. I don't I love the theory of the case, right? That in fact this isn't the same condition that caused it, but where's the work that says it's you don't need to? So if it is true that not every pediatrician or not every parent, and we know this is one of the problems in America is it's not the health care at the moment of crisis, it's the preventative care.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't hear the government saying this is the work that now we recommend. So where does everyone go consult their own experts? And does every expert have the wherewithal to have their own independent decision? And then if your pediatrician says that you shouldn't have it and you get it, is the are you gonna sue that pediatrician for malpractice? I mean, there are some good things about trusted solutions to common problems that allow society to continue to move. And what I hear with Hep B is a broad concern about vaccines in general,
Hmm.
not that this is going to that somehow the continuation of the vaccine is a health problem for you. So I haven't seen the studies say which is the greater health risk, continue to take Hep B or not doing it till later. And where's that work? And so again, I'm with you. I hate big government. But there are times when in a nation of 350 million people, expecting everyone to make their own decision, but we have this expectation that someone else is responsible too. I don't know. How do you change that as quickly as you want? So I think it's a great example of this is where we have eroded trust in the system, and we have this is a personal issue of who's bearing the risk of that.
Yeah, and just confidence in standard setting of bodies, right? Because that's really what this is a standard setting of bodies. Where it comes down is at the state level because the states adopt this and restrict students or children or whomever from participating in sports, going to school.
Yeah, we'll say this over and over again, and so we'll stop talking about it here because it's going to come up and we'll do some wrap up at the end. But this is where default to trust is an important element of societal motion. So think what happens when now every single decision you make has to be your considered decision, but every decision you make is also affecting society who goes to school with you.
Well, let's move on to the women in combat.
Woof.
And the Pentagon launched a 6-month review of women serving in ground combat roles, positions like infantry, armor, artillery, to assess their military effectiveness a decade after restrictions were lifted. The review, ordered by the Undersecretary of Defense Anthony Tata, directs Army and Marine Corps leaders to submit data on readiness, training performance, casualties, and unit climate to the Institute for Defense Analysis for evaluation. Past Army data found no reduction in effectiveness tied to gender integration, and the review comes amid broader Pentagon debates over standards and the role of women in combat. This isn't a 10-year review of the standards of combat arms in the military. This is a review of women in combat arms. I think there's a difference in the framing, and that is significant. So, Sue, what does it signal about institutional trust and military cohesion when leadership reopens a question that was considered settled? And how do service members and allies interpret that? Accountability or as undermining confidence in policy and unity?
Well, I should start with you before I pull out my feminist soapbox. I think this is the more charitable explanations in my book are undermined by what have clearly been this administration's move against women and minorities under the guise of anti-DEI, right? So it is hard for me to walk away from that kind of black cloud that hangs over this administration's view, a priori view of what an effective military member looks like.
Hmm.
And then when you do a study just on the effectiveness of women in combat, when you're assuming that the baseline of men in combat is the right baseline simply because of historical norms that led that to be what we had. I mean, that wasn't adjudicated based on some assessment of the exact proper mix of differences and different strengths and weaknesses. No, that was just where we were societally. and that became the baseline, and then you're looking at any change to that. Here we have the assault on Venezuela, almost all military operations are, as breathtaking successes, that the U.S. is able to pull off with integrated forces, and now we're gonna question whether women should be there in combat or not. It just feels part of a larger agenda, and the idea of taking that one element and examining it. I question whether it's going to make us more effective to even do the study. Certainly, I don't know how allies and partners are gonna view it. I think I know how the members of the military that happen to be women are gonna view it. It's like,
Yeah.
"Oh, seriously? How many times do we have to have this question?" I generally don't mind studies of whether we're doing what we're doing as well as we could. This one has a latent assumption that I don't know how it's not gonna be proven. And I don't know how you
Yeah.
look at just women's effectiveness without saying, "Well, let's do a concurrent study of men's effectiveness in the military."
Well, it should be an effectiveness of the combat arms.
Yeah, I just don't how you pull this one out and think that you're gonna get there. You and I have both seen so many studies on every front that just go with the presumption, and it doesn't just have to be on gender, on anything. You're like, "Well, that's"
Yeah, when you develop a study, how are you gonna identify bias? How are you gonna
Right,
mitigate bias?
right,
Because it's inherent in
right,
everything we do,
right,
right? But how do you
right,
reduce that to make it a proper
right.
study? And by framing it like this, you're
Yeah.
throwing it right up front.
You're throwing it right up front, and you're doing it against a population that is already feeling undermined, and so how is that gonna help with unit cohesion, right?
Yep.
How is that gonna help with the performance? So, I don't like it. It's how you frame a study, how you frame any analysis that is likely to determine the goodness of its outcome.
Mhm. Yep. Well, let's transition from a study to an investigation with Fed Chair Jerome Powell.
Yikes.
Federal prosecutors have opened a criminal investigation into the Federal Reserve Chair, serving him Friday with grand jury subpoenas over the Fed's renovation of the Washington headquarters and whether Chairman Powell lied to Congress about the scope of the project before the Senate Banking Committee last June. If you recall, last July, President Trump visited the site where the Fed building is being renovated, and there was some discussion about which buildings were under that phase of the contract and whatnot. Chairman Powell said, quote, "I have deep respect for the rule of law and for accountability in our democracy. No one, certainly not the chair of the Federal Reserve, is above the law, but this unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure." So if you were advising a
Yeah.
CEO, a governor, or an overseas company, what's the risk signal here? This legal process playing out or a precedent being set about the presumed independence of the Fed?
Yeah, so this is we're kind of on an escalation curve here in terms of impact. So the first one
Ramping up.
is mostly personal, that can turn into societal. The second one is kinda institutional, and this has big national effects. So first things first, we've been talking about the importance of the independence of the Fed, and really think of that as the central bank, right? Is our monetary policy separate from political agenda, right? And this is a fundamental tenet of who we are. It is something that we have steadfastly held. We have seen it when the Fed chair is more or less political, and you see what happens in terms of either stagflation or hyperinflation, depending on which way it goes. Well, I think only history will tell whether what Powell has done in the Fed coming out, if you think about from the first Trump administration through the Biden administration through now, I I think I could argue that they did a pretty steady job of keeping us from auguring in when it looked like we could have post-COVID. Who knows though, right? I also think history is gonna have to be
Sure.
the judge of that, right? So I don't know whether Powell's running of the Fed is going to be looked at as kindly or horribly by history. But what I do know is making it political is bad. And I will just say, and more than just for national interest, boy, we count on our partners to be able to believe in what they're seeing from the US economy and the investment markets and stuff. And history has shown what happens when countries mess with their central bank. Right? I
Hmm.
think I think countries like Venezuela and Russia and Turkey, you can see that they've gone into incredible periods of hyperinflation when you can't trust it, from which it is very difficult to recover. So this is a big one. I think it's really interesting why the president who has been very anti-Powell. He has clearly wanted the Fed to be a partner with him to try and shape the economy based on his policies, and he's been frustrated by that, and that hasn't yielded a change. This is interesting to choose a legal path and a legitimate crime of lying to Congress as a way to
Hmm.
go after a guy that's on his way out the door anyway. And I'm not really sure what he's trying to accomplish. I think he could awaken the sleeping giant of Congress, who typically have over the years valued the independence of the Fed.
Hmm. Right.
I think his statement and the video is remarkable. If you contrast him holding firm and saying that with, say, what Chris Wray did, who just kind of danced off stage without saying anything. Powell could have decided to just, "We're the Fed, we don't comment on this sort of thing. I'm gonna be leaving."
Right.
I think it speaks to the seriousness of our monetary policy, and that Powell feels it's important enough to defend. There are a lot of people that are gonna get caught up in this one, and I just again, you're breaking something that is hard to reconstitute in a way that lets society work or lets institutions work or lets our systems work.
Yeah.
What happens when now you can't trust the Fed?
The moniker "Too Late Powell," I don't know that it's not apt. History will judge, like you said. The Fed may have been a little late on adjusting interest rates, but that was a tough period too. We were printing money and doing stupid stuff to blow up the economy. But ultimately, the Fed needs to, we benefit and the world economy
Right.
benefits from having an independent Fed instead of the world thinking, all financial institutions concerned, that they're at the whim of the president. Because the rest of the country has such a impulsive view, and the rest of the world has such an impulsive view about
Right.
finances because it is money and we have such a short window and we see the tickers going up and down each day. But the Fed needs to have that long-term horizon and that really slow crank to try to change things instead of the economy falling off a cliff.
Yeah, Eric, something you said, I don't know that you and I have talked about this, about the decision making. This is why over the course of my career, I was never too bothered by what party the president was or who held power, because there's no law that says the president has to be good and the policies have to be good and that all decisions need to be good. That isn't malfeasant just because you make a bad decision. That's what
Mhm.
elections are for, and that's what the work is for. So I don't know that Powell did it right, but I don't think there's much evidence to say that there was anything other than the best judgment of the Fed in terms of what they were doing. Now, maybe it wasn't good. Maybe he has a bias toward conservatism. I mean, you could go back and look at Merrick Garland and say, "Oh my God, why was he so slow about doing stuff?" But
Mhm.
again, was there a malfeasance in his decision making? Or he held the spot and that was the decision he made. So I'm not sure that in the instantaneous judgment of whether his monetary policy was right or wrong is really what's at stake here.
Mhm.
And then, I mean, we can be circular on everything. Well, the president's the president. Doesn't he get to choose the leaders he has? Not willy-nilly. And again, I think the trust in this system, whether he did it right or wrong, did not erode trust,
Mhm.
right? The US economy is one of the most trusted in the world. That's why we have people who wanna invest in us and do things. If we blow that up, then I think we
Yeah.
have different things going on.
Well, and predictable, whether one way or the other, whether you agree with the policy or not, at least you know what they're doing and they're adjusting rates on a quarterly basis and making changes as required.
Right.
That's how you bake in your risk decisions from an investment standpoint
Right.
because you at least know what they're doing.
Right. And
Instead of
repeatable, transparent, and fair. It's what government's supposed to be. But you heard it here first. When you see a decision, ask first whether it was a legitimate decision to make before you judge whether the decision was right or wrong. Because unless you were sitting in that chair at that moment with all that information, it's really hard to know.
talking about economics, let's move on to the defense budget. Last Wednesday, President posted on Truth Social to set a military spending at 1.5 trillion in 2027, citing quote troubled and dangerous times. That's not untrue. Also, this will allow us to build the dream military that we have long been entitled to, and more importantly, that will keep us safe and secure regardless of foe. So you've said before that a tweet is not policy, but we were just balking a few weeks ago about the 2026 defense budget being nearly a trillion at $901 billion. To me, I think we've got to balance the budget first and reduce our deficit before we increase any spending, even in the military budget. But does this number meant to reflect a real threat assessment on what we need to keep America safe from a national security perspective? Or is this just him anchoring that conversation so anything lower, above 901 billion, seems reasonable now?
Well, I'm on the record of saying that I don't ascribe to this particular president any any ideology, any belief, or any ability to affect a larger strategy than what he wants or the leverage that he needs. So I think in this case, I'm not. I don't see it as a real threat assessment. Not that there aren't real threat assessments to be made, but I don't see this as a real threat assessment. I think more likely it's leverage against something else. To your point, just remember that the defense budget is one of the very few areas of discretionary spending that this nation has. And as we look to address our fiscal imbalance and balanced budgets and deficit spending that lead us to have interest payments that exceed our discretionary spending, there aren't many
Yeah.
places to look other than the defense budget. And then to say the president of peace is gonna increase it by another 50% to an outrageous number is just Looney Tunes to me. I like a strong federal government. I don't like a big one, and I don't like what's happened where we just keep adding on without reconsidering what we really need to try and do. I think almost all our big government institutions would be well served by cutting their budgets in half, having them focus on what must be done and building it up from there rather than just adding on to things, thinking that we're somehow magically going to find unwanted expenses. Look, Doge tried to do that, and what an epic failure that was, even though the intention of the idea was good. The idea of going in and cutting without an idea of what you're trying to achieve is as wrongheaded as going in and adding when you don't have any idea what you need to be able to do. So I don't like it. I think it's antithetical to the fiscal soundness we need to have to all the things we need to do. Where are you going to find that money to be able to do it? And I'm sorry, I have no idea what money the US has right now anyway. Oh, and we haven't even talked about, are we going to have an appropriation?
Hmm.
Are there gonna be
Right.
programs put in place? Is the Congress gonna have a say, about what these programs are? Are we gonna have any transparency into them? So, on so many levels, this doesn't feel, and I'm again going back to what is intellectually sound is periodically reconsidering whether the things you're doing are the things you need. This does not feel like it's a reflection of that, and if you actually did this, finding 500 billion to add to the military that is already doing this, on
Right.
top of the money we're throwing into DHS without any firm fixed view of what they're gonna do, I it feels like we're writing checks we won't be able to cash. And we're certainly not gonna be able to get to the real considerations of where this nation needs to be able to spend its money and be fiscally sound.
Yeah. I like spending money too. But unfortunately, we live in a world. I mean, I guess the federal government can keep printing, but then we're just pushing the buck down the road. But how does that affect our ability to trust in the institutions too? When you're talking about just continuing to up and up and up and these fantasy land projections of how much we're able to spend.
I think the way the world has turned, the way technologies have presented themselves, I think the military does need to reconsider what it buys, how it fights, what technologies it uses, who is providing that technology, all these questions of big primes versus new entrants. But but we're building battleships?
Yeah.
I don't see this all coming together. So even if you say the military needs to be rebuilt for modern times, it just feels like taking something that historically every American has believed in, national security and bipartisan support, and you're kind of playing on that and using it as a vanity project.
Well, we got one more here. Let's talk about Greenland. Administration officials are meeting with Denmark this week about Greenland. Last week, Secretary of State Marco Rubio told Congress the president remains interested in acquiring Greenland. But then the White House has since said that, quote, all options are on the table, including military ones. And on Friday, President Trump said, quote, we're going to do something on Greenland, whether they like it or not. So, what does this do to our allied trust when U.S. interests are framed as non negotiable, especially with partners, NATO ally Denmark, who thought they were operating inside these shared rules?
Yeah, I think in our escalation curve, this has really, really potentially some of the biggest effect. I've said before, I will maintain till my dying breath that one of the greatest advantages the U.S. has been that we've had friends
Hmm.
and that people could count on us and that we did things that are not always the same, not always right, not always for pure reasons, but there were certain things in which people could trust. I'm going to say three more sentences and I'm going to turn it to you because otherwise I'll lose my mind. This is so nonsensical.
Hmm.
First things first, in 2026 and beyond, the way you achieve security is not by acquiring a piece of land. I mean, anything we wanted to do to make Greenland secure, we could do through partnership. So let's be really, really clear about that. But let's say that this administration decides that it's going to do it the hard way. Let's say we do it the hard way and we actually make a move to take Greenland. It will NATO will end.
Yeah.
I can go off for a rant on times when NATO's been feckless. I don't think the president was wrong to expect NATO nations to put in their share of resources. But one
Yeah.
of the greatest peacekeeping keepers of the world order, of protecting the weak from the strong through alliance. If we were to do it the hard way, it doesn't matter whether NATO's response would be to live up to Article 5 and counter us, or if they decided, "Nah, we don't wanna counter them." Either way, action or no action, if we did that, NATO would be over.
Yeah.
And the deleterious consequence of that, again, on a world order that says, despite what we're trying to do in our own hemisphere, that the powerful can do what they want, will vanish. I think Greenland is one of the real canaries in the coal mine here. Of all the things we're talking about, each of which has some sense in terms of the examination of it, even if the choice of action could undermine trust. This has no basis in, as far as I can see, in reason, and if it were affected, would have massive consequence for generations in terms of global stability. What do you think?
Yeah. You want to talk New World Order?
Phew.
Goodbye. Goodbye to NATO would be something else.
You and I live in these governmental systems, man, we've seen it. Eric, you've participated. You've seen the disparities. But I think the whole point of this episode is it isn't just the action, it's whether you can trust.
Hmm.
Whether you can trust expertise and free and open societies don't wait to be told what's right or wrong. What exists is presumed to be valid, and that allows us to have achieved the things we have over time. And each one of these things that we've talked about today is really threatening to undermine that.
Hmm.
And when that happens, it is a bigger effect than an out of control spending by the
Yeah.
Defense Department. It means that you can't trust anything, or it's a bigger effect than whether we should take a Hep B virus vaccination as an infant or sometime later. I don't know how we work if every individual is making their own decision. And just not to put too fine a point on it, to kind of jump out of the realm of the decisions, the things we've talked about, is it's like the rule of law. I think we have companies right now that are really, really enjoying the patronage system that seems to be evolving, forgetting that the reason they've made the massive amounts of money they have over time is because of the rule of law that have allowed us to be good partners that people can invest in, that things can be done against this.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I think our takeaway from this segment, I hope we've done a decent job of kind of putting the thought out there that the consequence of some of these actions is bigger than the action itself, but rather the erosion of trust. And so, as we've talked about, when individuals participate in decision making or select people to be their representatives, there ought to be a lot of questions that are posed to them of how is this going to work and how you go forward. Before we kind of wrap up, I read a really, really good article suggested to me by the head of Security, a friend of our program, Lauren Buida, and she pointed out this article written by Garrett Graff, who's a longtime friend of mine, who writes really, really interesting assessments of national security, geopolitics, and history and democracy. And he wrote an article, and let's see if we can link it in our show notes,
Okay.
called "The Physical Weight of Trumpism." And it's kind of on this general theme of why are we all feeling such disquiet with what's happening? And it's more than the events themselves. It's more about the aggregate effect of little things that are eroding what we used to be able to trust. And again, leaders come and go. Leaders have been good and bad. Le- Leaders have been corrupt and less so. That isn't new. This isn't about this particular, it is the combination of these things. When the institutions don't hold, when you can't believe the data, then you start not being able to operate. Do you have any wrap-up
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah, because when we moved from a hunter gatherer to an agrarian society, right, it allowed us to develop a society and develop cultures because people had more capacity to do things. There were folks who didn't have to worry all day about where their food was coming from. They were able to focus on trades and crafts and develop societal things that we all benefit from. And if you now have to go in and inspect every single thing in your life, if you have to test your own gasoline to make sure that it's 87 and not 93 or 93 and not 87, then you don't have time to do things and our
Right.
whole society degrades because you now have to validate everything instead of trusting experts. And that's from the very dawn of our societies as we develop them, it's relied on trust from the roads, the libraries, and the power lines.
Yep, yep. Well, there you go. All right, what are we watching?
What are you watching? You want me to go first or you want to go first?
You go first.
All right. Venezuela. Still watching that. Potentially 30 to 50 million barrels of crude headed to the United States. That's roughly $2 billion worth to be distributed at the president's discretion. And then he also had a meeting on Friday with a bunch of the oil executives that I don't think were as receptive to want to go into Venezuela, or they're a little more hesitant than initially thought. And I think a lot of that stems from back in 2007 when Chavez nationalized the oil system. Some big U.S. companies, ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, both had to leave or elected to leave very quickly, and they lost a lot of money. There were arbitration awards, and they're still owed 1.6 billion and 8.7 billion respectively. I think they're looking at it from an investment standpoint of, hey, I'm still owed this money from when I left 20 years ago. Where is that going to come from, and how are you going to guarantee that before I go and try to invest in Venezuela again?
Yeah, I think that's what you heard, right? And I think what listeners ought to hear is they're asking for security guarantees. And
Yep.
and that's money. So again, further pressure on our economy.
Hmm. And the other one's Iran. So we talked
But
about the protests last week. Looks like they're increasing, escalating. They've got a very educated, young population that doesn't want to live under this regime anymore, it would seem. So we'll see if that's a spark that they need to another big disruption to the world order. That would be.
yeah, I think as I've watched Iran over, I don't know, the last 15 or so years,
Yeah.
um, I think one of the things that many Iran watchers have felt is that there is that population that is more moderate, that is looking for something more than they have in a repressive regime, but
Yeah.
but the West has not given them an alternative that they can choose. Like, we can't decide on whether we're still gonna be hardliners that, restricting their oil and
Yeah.
cutting them off from the thing. So, I think the challenge we have with Iran nationally and from kinda international policy is what are we making available for those moderates and that young educated population to say, yeah, we want that. That's available to us if we do this. And so I'm not sure that we have the completeness of the Iran policy that allows that to happen. Well, now I see what happens when I go first. I get to pick from everything, and then you always you have to find something else. So here's what am I watching? Boy, I don't think we're done with Minnesota.
Somali daycares.
Well, there's Somali daycares. Oh, man, we haven't talked about that and what happened with the glut of funds that were available locally to systems that were unable to to have the infrastructure to be able to manage massive influx
Hmm.
of federal dollars. And and I'm not saying that excuses all corruption and fraud, but I will say that dumping a lot of money into local systems without any governance. And then what happens to anyone who gets money from the federal government, the minute it arrives, they're saying, "Have you spent it? How have you spent it? How have you spent it? How have you spent it?
Right.
And we're gonna take it back." And so if you don't have the infrastructure to spend it wisely, this sort of thing can happen. I was thinking about Renee Good,
Yeah. There's a lot
and
going on in Minnesota.
yeah, I think the thing I wanna watch there is I think the state has to have some investigation of this.
Oh, for
It
sure.
right. So that's what I'm really watching is the state's action. We're seeing what the federal government is doing. Put your politics aside, folks. What we've seen over this incident is some of the worst leadership out of the federal government that I have ever experienced in my life. I mean, they're just Eric, you know this. I think you knew this when you came out of basic school about ways you lead, ways you deal with crisis, how you share information, and what your overall responsibility is. But I do think this is a big test of states. And so, what I'm watching in Minnesota is what's the state gonna do to launch the investigation and to be able to have that as the federal government decides what it's gonna do, and I'll stop there because otherwise I'll think Greenland's okay compared to compared to this. And then I think the other thing that I'm gonna watch is Congress, and kind of the Fed Powell thing has got me thinking about this. We saw some Republicans crossing the bipartisan line, when it came to the War Powers Act,
Yeah.
and so what I'm kind of watching to see is that just kind of a one-off in a very safe space in an area that has been historically very bipartisan, which is foreign policy, and so it's not gonna have any snowball effect, or can we look for kind of an emergent precedent test? Is the Congress now having seen some of that bipartisanship come out? Are we going to see a reversion to some bipartisan action? So I'm watching Congress a little bit. You know what I'm hoping for is for the Congress to say, "Oh, that's right. We are responsible to this thing we've been talking about today, which is how our society works and maintains its structure." I'm not sure that I think just those 5 Republicans crossing that bipartisan line on foreign policy is enough to say
Yeah.
that we're gonna have a durable bipartisan coalition, nor am I sure that this is gonna usher in a shift in terms of bipartisanship on domestic policy. But I think on the issue of trust, I do think it's an interesting to test to see whether institutional loyalty can outweigh party loyalty. And then I guess the last thing I'm watching, but I'm hoping our listeners are watching. Last week, one of our 2026 efforts was to put out a written product that's kind of a listener's guide that goes with each of our episodes. I did it badly because I put out a listener's guide like 4 days after we put out the episode. And so people read the listener's guide on Substack and they're like, what? This makes no sense because they hadn't listened to our episode. Now it did prompt new listeners, but still we'll do that again. And so hopefully we'll do it contemporaneous with the release of this episode, where you'll see it in the show notes and you'll find it on Substack. We're just trying every day to be more and more true to our intention, which is to do something good for the women and men of America and free and open societies.
Nice. Well, that's what we're watching and how we see it. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
So thanks for joining us. As Eric said, we're excited to start a second year with you. Love to hear what you think. We're going to have more and more ways for you to be able to share those thoughts. Join us next week for Understandable Insights wherever you listen and watch. We love that we're on YouTube and have some Instagram reels. And for each one of you, go forth, do good, and for goodness sake, be kind to one another, because it makes all the difference.